In the center of Manhattan, among the glass facades of a bank, the morning began with a quiet banking glitch. It was not a noise, not a crash, not a disaster. It was a silence, just like the silence before the first domino falls, like the calm before the storm. On that day, the banking system that was designed to be absolutely sound and safe for its customers failed, but not for a technical reason. The problem was not in the hardware or the code. The problem was that someone had used the structure of the banking system itself as a tool to make a huge amount of money disappear without anyone noticing. $2 million in one of the Federal Reserve Bank's internal reserve accounts disappeared in an instant. They were not withdrawn, and they were not stolen, and even more so, no one spent them. Everything is much simpler. They simply disappeared, like numbers on a screen that never existed. The disappearance was unhacked, unalarmed, and unmarked. Logs were clean, checksums were correct, and the bank's internal security monitors showed no errors. It was a brilliant robbery that changed the financial system and world order forever. So be sure to watch this video to the end so as not to miss anything interesting. And also write in the comments from what point of the world you're watching this video. It will be interesting to read. The only thing that gave away the anomaly and indicated that the money had been stolen was the analyst's intuitive feeling that a line was missing from the report. It had not been reset, it simply did not exist. This was the first brick in a wall that no one had noticed before. The incident was immediately classified. It was not forwarded to the bank's security service, nor was it registered in the police database. Instead, it was placed in a closed digital network that no more than 10 people in the country had access to. Those who followed such situations, not in the news, but in reality. The system that lost the money was one of the most secure on the planet. Only employees with long-term clearance had access to it, and every step they took was recorded in real time. The level of encryption used in the data warehouses exceeded Pentagon standards. External attacks were cut off as they approached. Internal ones were blocked before anyone could reach the critical segment. But this time, nothing worked, because it was not an attack. It was a reconfiguration, carried out not through destruction, but through substitution. As if someone had not invaded the system, but had become part of it. As if the bank itself wanted to forget about the 2 million. An analysis of all connections over the last 72 hours yielded nothing. There was no external traffic, no spikes in activity, no attempts to log in from unknown devices. Internal channels also showed no violations. At the level of access, rights, and operation logs, everything was perfect. All that was recorded was one line in the memory dump, the syntax of which did not correspond to any programming language. It looked like a fragment of fiction woven into the system structure as a decorative element. It could not be deciphered by traditional means, because it was not code, it was a marker. That same morning across the country, at a small college in the town of Drakewood, everything was going on as usual. The hallways creaked with floorboards, glass doors let in soft light, and chairs were being placed in classrooms. Building 3, an old brick building, smelled of wood and dust and time. On the 3rd floor in room 314, a literature professor was getting into his usual rhythm. His name was listed on the schedule as Mark Bello, and his lectures were considered mandatory for anyone who aspired to an academic career. He was never late. He never forgot his topics. He did not use electronic resources. His world was analog, almost archaic. He lived in paper, in ink, in old books with cracked spines. His face was familiar to every student, but no one knew where he lived. No one had heard of his past. No one knew what he did before he showed up on campus. He didn't just teach text. He taught thinking. His course on narrative structure was considered one of the most difficult, not because of the complexity of the material, but because of the need to think. He didn't give ready-made answers, didn't give high marks for trivial thoughts. His criteria were abstract, as if he saw not only what was written, but also the motivation with which the text was created. His attention to detail was almost painful. He noticed typos, missing commas, inconsistencies in argumentation. He analyzed essays not as a teacher, but as an investigator, and no one guessed that there was another life beyond his course, or rather, another reality. On the very day that the bank's system stopped counting $2 million as part of its structure, Bellows stood at the blackboard, explaining the structure of power through the prism of rhetoric. He didn't look the students in the eye. He looked through them, not because he despised them, because he already knew that they were missing the point. His words sounded like philosophical formulas, but they were instructions. Every example, every reference, every structural transition was not just an element of a lecture. It was a mirror of his own design. He wasn't teaching, he was rehearsing, and no one realized that at that very moment, the man standing before them had caused the most complex cyber operation in history, one that could neither be proven nor disproven. Mark Bello was not someone who caught the eye of the press or became the talk of the staff room. He existed outside social context as an independent figure in the academic landscape, unaffected by fashion or institutional dynamics. His arrival at the college had been a quiet one. He had simply filled a vacancy a few years earlier and started lecturing. There was no talk of his previous employment, no colleagues who could attest to his career path. His resume was formally impeccable: publications, references, academic degrees. But it all seemed too neat, as if the documents were designed to be unquestioned. In the eyes of the students, he was almost a myth. No one saw him off campus. No one met him in a store, on the street, in a cafe. It was as if he dissolved the moment he closed the door of the classroom. Some tried to find out where he lived, but the search always ended in nothing. He was not tied to the local area, did not have subscriptions, did not receive paper mail. His name was not on the list of tenants. His profile in the university system was minimal: a photo, a position, a schedule. No biography, no interests, no mentions. He was there, but it was as if he did not exist. His colleagues treated him with wary respect. He did not engage in discussions at methodological meetings, did not participate in projects, did not make friends. But they listened to him. His decisions on courses were made without discussion. His structure of disciplines was not subject to revision. There was something inaccessible about him that made others keep their distance. He did not conflict, but he did not cooperate either. He did not complain, did not ask, did not think. He was an autonomous element of the system, as if he existed on another level of its architecture. His office was in the farthest wing of Building 3, Room 307. The door was always closed but not locked. Inside were wooden bookcases, a desk covered with papers, and a massive leather chair. The computer was an old CRT monitor, with a keyboard with yellow keys and an operating system that had not been updated in 10 years. On the walls were engravings, newspaper clippings, and diagrams that looked more like architectural plans. He did not turn on the lamp if there was enough daylight. He did not open the windows. He sat at the table like a chess player before a game, in complete concentration, as if there was no sound, no movement, no time outside the room. He had no assistants. He did not use presentations, did not send materials by mail. His courses existed exclusively within the framework of live presence. He spoke, the students wrote. He asked questions, they answered. But the structure of these interactions was different. He did not simply lecture. He created an atmosphere in which the students' consciousness began to work differently. He did not ask questions, but vectors of reflection. His topics were not only about literature. They concerned the nature of control, the structure of power, the mechanisms of manipulation through text. He did not explain, he introduced into the system. And if someone began to understand, then they understood not a separate work, but the logic of the entire world. Students shared their feelings. Some felt anxious after his classes, others inspired. But they all said the same thing. He made them think, not just about analyzing text, but about their own beliefs. He talked about the influence of wording on choice, about how syntax can change behavior. His lectures were like algorithms. They started a process. And no one knew that this process was not just educational. It was part of a system that Bello had been building for years, a system in which he was the only user and the only observer. No one noticed that each of his courses was built on a pattern identical to the architecture of a complex hacking operation: input, transformation, manipulation, output. He taught students not how to analyze text, but how to use text as a tool. His exams were models. His assignments were codes. And all of this was necessary not for evaluation, but to test one thing: Who could perceive information the way he did? Because Bello was not just looking for students, he was looking for those who could become part of his system or those who would try to destroy it. And while analysts in New York were trying to figure out how millions could disappear from a secure system, Bello was quietly working at his desk. He wasn't on the network. He wasn't leaving any traces. He was just writing another lecture outline. But in reality, he was creating a new sequence of operations. Because for him, a lecture was a form of code, and the audience was an interface. And in this interface, he worked more accurately than any hacker, because he was not controlling machines, but thinking. Mark Bello's story did not begin at Drakewood College. It began in another time and place, where he was not a teacher, but an architect of digital constructs that official records were silent about. Before Bello's name appeared on the schedule of Building 3, it was part of another system, hidden from view, scrubbed of mention, sterilized of traces. His real name did not appear in open databases. His previous life had been erased as carefully as those 2 million that disappeared from the bank's reserve. He had once been part of one of the most secretive research groups at the intersection of cybersecurity and psychological modeling. The group had no formal name, but existed under a series of internal designations, one of which, Nogue 9, was listed in the archives as having been abolished. In reality, it had simply changed format. Bello was not a professor then, but a top-level analyst working at the interface of algorithms and linguistics. His job was to develop language models that could bypass digital barriers without being recognized as code. He created text structures that would be embedded in systems not as a virus, but as part of a protocol. He used language as a means of intrusion, not through hacking, but through integration. Bello worked in a team of 6 people. They all disappeared within a year. The official versions are accidents, voluntary disappearances, mental breakdowns. Bello did not disappear. He left. He did not run away, did not hide, but rather logged out of the system, nullifying his participation. He erased the data, handed over his work, and at the last moment refused to sign a waiver of access. This was his first act of insubordination. He did not take the information with him. He took the principles with him. What others considered tools became philosophy for him. He no longer needed support. He realized that he was able to create his own system, not under the auspices, not under observation, but in the shadows. It was then that he began to shape a new path, the path of an observer who does not interfere directly, but changes the landscape, moving the foundations. He began by building an autonomous platform. It was not a server, not a botnet, not a system. It was a concept, a digital model embedded in the dead zones of old networks. It created structures within the forgotten fragments of old archives, embedded itself in metadata, used principles of anonymity that exceeded the capabilities of standard cryptography. It did not hide. It became part of the noise. Its structure existed as a background, as a void between action and response. In these intervals, it developed its network, using the principles of fiction as camouflage. No one was looking for a hacker in a library. No one was looking for an intrusion in the form of an essay. He returned to the civilized world, choosing a college in a provincial town. Not because he wanted solitude, but because he knew that any system is vulnerable at the periphery. In the center, control. On the outskirts, freedom. And in this freedom, he began his experiment. He did not intend to repeat the mistakes of others. He did not build an empire. He created influence, not through money, not through power, but through the structure of consciousness. His audience was only part of the plan. He did not need hundreds of followers. A couple of dozen minds capable of perceiving his approach were enough. Because real hacking is not about penetrating a system. It is about transforming perception. The appearance of his pseudonym in the Federal Reserve logs was not a mistake. It was a signal, not a warning, not a threat, a reminder. His signature, stylized as an artistic construct, was left in the system like a key. Those in the know knew immediately who they were dealing with, but they couldn't say it out loud, because then they'd have to admit that the man who could erase a transaction from the centralized vault had once been part of their own team. They'd have to admit that the system had failed long before he disappeared. They were watching, but he knew it, and he left a trace to remind them he hadn't returned as an intruder. He had returned as an author. The first to question the integrity of Professor Bellow's character was a student who was not looking for the hidden. He was not attracted by the eccentricities, the unusual habits, or the abstract metaphors of the lectures. He simply noticed an inconsistency in the text. It was an essay submitted by another student, checked by Bellow, and returned with corrections. Among the corrections was a marginal comment, written in a thin pen in a style reminiscent of machine font. The comment contained a grammatically correct but semantically inappropriate sentence that, upon closer inspection, revealed the logic of code. Not the logic of literary analysis, but a sequence of operators encrypted in syntax. The student, an amateur programmer, didn't report it. He took it as a chance find. But when similar phrases started appearing in other papers, his interest turned to alarm. He began collecting copies of the essays available in the shared system. He noticed that certain phrases were repeated. They had no literary function, no meaning, no interpretation. They were constants, fixed blocks, scattered throughout the documents so as not to catch the eye. They resembled hashes, not digital but syntactic. Each fragment made sense only in the context of the entire structure. It was as if each student, without knowing it, was part of a distributed computation. Further observations only increased suspicion. Bellow never used the university platform to upload materials, but once a month a strange glitch occurred on campus. For several minutes, the local network recorded a sharp increase in incoming traffic not associated with any active users. The port through which the traffic passed was formally disabled, but the system, despite its limitations, showed the activation of a gateway connected to the server room of Building 3. The requests did not come from outside. They were initiated internally and went to external nodes belonging to no known operator. All attempts to track them ended in vain. Several faculty members discussed the outages, but none connected them to Bellow. They thought they were a hardware defect, perhaps a product of old infrastructure. Only one person began to connect the dots. The outages always coincided with moments when Bellow was on campus longer than usual. He never explained why. He never cited a test or claimed overload. He just stayed, and the data was transmitted. The student continued his investigation cautiously. He did not report his findings, did not share his doubts, but he began attending Bellow's lectures with a tape recorder. He recorded every phrase so that he could analyze the structure after deciphering it, and he began to find patterns, phrases that had no relation to the topic, but repeated in a certain sequence. These were not ordinary speech structures. These were commands built into speech. They did not control technology. They controlled attention. Bellow used the lecture as a form of coding. He implanted chains of words into the student's consciousness that triggered associative reactions, tuning them to a certain way of thinking. It wasn't control, it was tuning. He wasn't ordering. He was building an algorithm. And if you think of his audience not as a group of students, but as a neural network, it became clear that Bellow was teaching not knowledge, but patterns. He was creating a reflection of his system in the minds of others. And the system worked. 10 years ago, Bellow's name was not yet associated with teaching. He existed under another name, in a digital environment where identity is determined not by a passport, but by access level. His nickname, known in closed circles as Tractatus, was surrounded by many legends, most of which could not be verified. He did not publish manifestos, did not blog, did not participate in forums. He left only actions, and behind his actions, there remained anomalies. Failures that could not be analyzed, and disappearances of information that could not be explained by either external influences or internal errors. Tractatus did not hack systems, he rewrote them. His approach was not to overcome defenses, he created conditions in which defenses became redundant. He was introduced into the network architecture as a neutral element, not upsetting the balance, but changing it from within. He did not copy data, he replaced its meaning. He did not erase traces, he made the system itself refuse to acknowledge the fact of intrusion, and this was his specialty. He did not attack, he persuaded. One of his most famous maneuvers was an operation that would later be dubbed foundation distortion. It wasn't a financial structure hack, a data theft, or a system shutdown. It was an intervention in the micro-political decision-making process of a multinational corporation. Over the course of 8 months, Tractatus quietly implanted modified reports into the company's internal analytics system. These reports didn't lie. They didn't distort the numbers. They simply changed the emphasis. They prioritized some data and downgraded others. As a result of this shift, the company began making decisions that would lead to its own destruction. By the time it was revealed, it was too late. The management structure had already been dismantled, and the strategy was beyond repair. Tractatus disappeared immediately after that. Its digital trail ended in one of the neutral zones through which the origin of the signals could not be traced. It was assumed that it had either left or been destroyed. But those who understood the scale of its capabilities knew Tractatus does not simply leave. It disappears only when the goal is achieved. And then version 2.0 began, now under the name of Mark Bello. At that point, his focus shifted. He no longer looked for vulnerabilities in systems. He began to study vulnerabilities in perception. He realized that the complexity of code has a limit, but the complexity of thought does not. He realized that if you learn to manage attention, interpretation, and meaning, you can achieve more than any digital tool. And then he took a step that would have seemed absurd to any hacker. He went offline. He became physical, social, material. He became a teacher. He chose a place where he was not known. He constructed a new biography, put together a dossier that could withstand scrutiny, and got a job at a college that did not arouse suspicion. Everything he did seemed part of the ordinary. Lectures, notes, books. But this was a facade. The real work began the moment the classroom doors closed and Bello began to speak. His speech was not ordinary. It had an internal rhythm, a structure similar to the architecture of machine code. Each paragraph, each sentence structure was not just material, it was an instruction, encrypted in a humanitarian form. That's when he began a project he called the Mental Core. His goal wasn't to teach. His goal was to create an environment in which the behavior of consciousness could be modeled, not through control, but through tweaking parameters, not through coercion, but through creating conditions in which a person would choose the right path. His students didn't know they were variables in an equation, and each semester, Bello analyzed which combinations produced the right result. Because for him, teaching wasn't a mission, it was a laboratory. And everything he did was subject to one rule: maximum impact with minimum intervention. While Bello was building his intellectual network of students and simultaneously manipulating the logic of perception, he was still working on what would become his original method: infiltrating infrastructure without creating anomalies. He knew that any system, be it a network, an organization, or a human brain, has points at which a lie can be anchored so that it is perceived as truth. At these points, it is important not to distort the data, but to change the very framework of interpretation. His theft of 2 million was not a test of the strength of an algorithm. It was a demonstration of the concept of how to make the structure itself want to forget its part. The Federal Reserve, for all its security, had one weak point: its internal routine. Procedures, honed to the point of automatism, served as the foundation of predictability. Bello exploited this. He introduced into the system not a virus, but a pattern. By exploiting vulnerabilities in standard reporting mechanisms, he created a template that imitated system behavior, a template that replaced part of the data with its formally equivalent shadows. These shadows had the same properties as the original, but were not connected to reality. They did not show up as an error because each level of verification received the correct parameters. Only in the case of a full manual audit would it be possible to notice that the data was missing. But by then, everything was already done. He didn't act directly. He used a chain of digital proxies scattered across the archive nodes of old educational institutions, libraries, and scientific servers. Each of them was activated not simultaneously, but in a strictly defined sequence. Their job was not to hack, but to transmit fragments of structure, like the pages of a book, from which only in a certain order can an entire chapter be assembled. This chapter, once assembled, became the key. But unlike traditional keys, it did not open the door. It made the door disappear. The day of the operation was not chosen by chance. It coincided with an internal audit and a system update, which created a cross-talk effect. In such conditions, attention is distributed unevenly. Services are overloaded, priorities change, and subtle deviations are lost among the many processes. Bello did more than just know this. He calculated how the human factor would act under pressure. He built an algorithm based not only on the logic of the code, but also on the behavioral model of those who serviced it. This was the essence of his strategy, to work not against the system, but with its internal weaknesses, built into it in advance. He tested everything in advance. Each lecture in which he embedded certain phrases was not just a theoretical exercise, but a test. He tracked how receptive the audience was to the change in emphasis. He watched how the students responded to the substituted logical constructions. If they accepted the new form as natural, it meant that the mechanism worked. He applied the same principle to the digital structure. If the system did not signal an error, it meant that it was ready to accept lies as the norm. After the operation was complete, Bello did not remove the traces. He disguised them as old errors. He embedded them in replicas of old system bugs that were already listed as known anomalies. That way, even if someone were to investigate, they would find that the problem had already been recorded and was no longer a threat. He used the system's history against it. He used its habit of inefficiency as a means of camouflage. While the security service analyzed hundreds of hypotheses, Bello continued to teach. He did not look different, did not behave suspiciously, did not change his rhythm. For him, the operation was over the moment the system accepted its result as normal. Not when the money disappeared, but when no one asked a question. And that was the real deception. He did not run away. He stayed. Because he understood that the best disguise is absolute transparency. And while everyone else was looking for a shadow, he stood under the lights, on the podium, in front of the students, and lectured on the tragedy hidden under the mask of order. Drakewood College, despite its provincial reputation, had a technical infrastructure that was easy to underestimate. The campus was connected to several government and educational programs, including archival projects, digital repositories, and distributed computing pilots for research initiatives. Most of the staff didn't care. To them, they were budget lines, traffic schedules, and formalities for system administrators. But to Bello, they were a gateway, not to a database, not to the internet, to another environment, at once far more vulnerable and secure. He knew that any digital system designed to integrate with other structures inevitably contains nodes through which one can embed one's own code. For him, this was the university network. He did not use it directly. He created virtual tunnels, disguised as automatic synchronization processes between labs, departments, and external platforms. He did not create traffic. He modified the existing one, replacing data packets at the moment of transmission. His intervention was imperceptible because each modified packet had the same structure as the original, but carried a different meaning. Bello didn't care about passwords, access, or control panels. He didn't steal accounts or duplicate logins. His system was deeper. He built a network within a network, a structure that lived in the background, wasn't detected by any antivirus, didn't require administrator rights, and didn't violate formal rules. It didn't intercept data, it rewrote it. Every time a student logged into an internal platform or a teacher uploaded materials, part of the process passed through a node created by Bello. He didn't store information, he filtered perception. The basis of this system were the very patterns that he tested in his lectures. He created patterns of thinking, and these patterns were built into interfaces. When a user worked with an interface, he interacted not only with the system, but also with the way it was organized. Bello modified this organization. He changed the emphasis, the navigation structure, the order of the display. His goal was not to control actions. His goal was to control the logic of choice. He did not force students to press certain buttons. He made them choose the right ones themselves. The system he built was autonomous. It didn't depend on an external server. It had no central core. It existed as a collection of interactions between users. It was a symbiote, a structure that was activated only when someone initiated an interaction. The rest of the time, it was dead, a collection of fragments that posed no threat. But when activated, each user became part of it. They became a host. And that's how Bello achieved what no other hacker had ever done. He built a system that lived on attention. This structure had many levels. The first one had simple modifications. The second one had patterns that influenced perception. The third one had behavioral chains. But there was a fourth level. It was only activated when the user demonstrated a certain sequence of choices, a certain type of analysis, a certain structure of thinking. Then the system opened an additional segment, not direct access, but an opportunity to go further. And if the person moved in the right direction, he found himself in a new interface. There were no longer lectures, schedules, or assignments. There was a language built on code, but structured like a philosophy. It was the core of the system, and only those who proved that they were capable of thinking differently had access to it. Bello did not control this access. He did not manage the choice. He created conditions under which the choice became a filter. He did not select. He observed. And if someone reached the core, it meant only one thing. He was ready. What for? It was no longer Bello who decided, because at this level, control passed to another plane. There a game began, the rules of which only he knew. And while the system functioned, no one could stop it, because formally, it did not exist. All operations, even the most carefully thought out, contain a vulnerability. Not technological, not logical, but human. Bello knew this better than anyone. His system was built with mathematical precision. His project existed beyond suspicion. But he miscalculated in one thing. Not in the algorithm, not in the code, in the unpredictability of human attention. There were no security experts at the college, no professional cryptanalysts, but there were students. And among the students, those who did not search but found, did not analyze but sensed anomalies. One of the students, a participant in the startup program at the digital modeling department, began noticing strange shifts in the university's interface. He didn't know what was wrong, but he sensed that the system was behaving differently. First, there were delays in logging in. Then, there were inconsistencies in the way certain pages were displayed. Then, there were differences in the structure of courses that only became apparent when compared to archived copies. He began keeping a journal of these deviations. At first, he chalked them up to bugs or botched updates. But when he noticed that the anomalies coincided with Bello's periods of activity, his interest turned to investigation. The student connected external monitoring tools. He installed local traps that recorded data packets when accessing university servers. Most of the traffic was standard, but at certain moments he began to catch packets whose structure did not correspond to any known protocol. They did not contain a payload, did not show signs of malware. But every time these packets appeared, the platform interface changed. And not for all users, but only for a certain group. These were Bello's students. The investigation proceeded slowly. The student had no access to the system core, no authority, but he had access to information. He began analyzing the fragments of code left in the cache and discovered repeating signatures, sequences of symbols that were not used in normal programming. He began to reconstruct the chain, and the further he went, the more convinced he became that this was not a bug or an experiment. This was a system, complex, multi-layered, autonomous, and it had a purpose that he could not yet determine. Bello's final mistake was to trust his own infallibility. He didn't expect a student without access to be able to replicate the path to one of the levels. But it did. And when the student got to the second level of the system, the interface changed. He saw not just material, but structure. He realized he was part of an experiment. He realized he was not being taught, but being affected. And he began to copy the data. He didn't know how it worked, but he knew it was important. He approached a young computer science professor without revealing the source. Together, they began to decode the structure. They found nested blocks, each tied to logical patterns that mimicked reasoning. They saw an attempt to build a thinking module, not an artificial intelligence, but a simulation of thinking. Not a copy of the mind, but an instrument of influence. It was a system designed not to control, but to guide decisions. And it worked. Because those who studied with Bello began to think the way he wanted. They didn't know they were being watched, but they were. The system hadn't leaked beyond the department. Yet, the teacher and the student kept the data safe, not sharing it with the administration or the police. They knew that an indictment against Bello would require evidence they didn't have. But they began to build a structure in response. They needed to understand how deep it had gone. And most important, they wanted to know why. Because if Bello had created a structure of thought, the question wasn't how he'd done it. It was what he was preparing everyone for. The discovery of the system's second level marked the beginning of a new phase. It was no longer an academic curiosity or an internal investigation. It had become a pursuit, albeit an unspoken one. The teacher and the student were no longer analyzing the structure. They were looking for a way to go beyond it. They wanted to understand not only how it worked, but who else was involved. But with each step forward, they felt the walls closing in. Bello's system wasn't just observing, it was reacting. At the university infrastructure level, inexplicable things began to happen. Archived records disappeared, access to old courses was blocked. The personal accounts of students who attended Bello's lectures began updating in the background. A computer science professor lost access to his administrative panel without explanation. The technical support he contacted assured him that there had been a glitch, but soon the account itself was restored, with a complete reset of all activity for the past 6 months. To an outside observer, it looked like another system error, but he knew this was a trace. The system was defending itself. Meanwhile, Bello continued to work. On the surface, everything was the same. His lectures were on schedule, students were graded, and they discussed literary works. But the tension in the classrooms was different. Some students began to feel anxious. They couldn't explain the source, but they sensed that something had changed. The exam questions became more abstract, the assignments less predictable. The structure of the courses became fragmented, as if someone was deliberately shaking up the foundation to prepare for the new format. At this point, the teacher and student began to work through back channels. They contacted an old alumnus who worked for a contractor that serviced the college's network architecture. Through him, they gained access to the blocked logs. These logs contained activity on the server that was broadcasting Bello's internal course system. They confirmed one thing: there was a fourth level. There were isolated attempts to log in. All of them were rejected, except for one. The entry was dated 3 weeks earlier and belonged to a student whose name was listed among those who had disappeared from the university in the middle of the semester. Officially, she left of her own accord. In reality, no one ever heard from her again. The administration didn't provide her contact information. Dorm mates said she simply disappeared. Her things were packed, her laptop was missing. The cameras didn't record her exit. The disappearance was registered as voluntary departure, but the log they found proved she had passed through level 4. This was the moment when doubt turned to fear. If the system led people to the point where they disappeared, then they were not facing an experiment, but something bigger, perhaps something that was never intended for outside intervention. Bello did not build a system for influence. He created a mechanism for transition to where no one knew. But the fact remained, someone had crossed over, and they did not return. The hunt was not for Bello, it was for understanding. But every step toward truth brought them closer to a system where the act of observation could change the observer. And the deeper they went, the clearer one thing became. Bello knew he was being watched, and perhaps that was what he had been waiting for. Bello was no longer in hiding. He did not change his schedule, he did not leave, he did not slow down his work. On the contrary, he began to act with even greater openness. His lectures became public, he initiated interdepartmental discussions, he began open seminars to which anyone could come. To observers, this looked like a desire for academic freedom. To those who knew what was behind it, it looked like a show of force. He laid out the pieces on the board not for camouflage, but for play. And every move he made was calculated not for defense, but for offense. The student and the teacher, despite the growing danger, continued to dig deeper. They tried to reproduce the path of the student who disappeared after the 4th level was activated. They reconstructed the sequence of clicks, the route through the interface, the moments of data entry. But at a certain point, the path broke off. The interface went to a white screen, after which nothing happened. Officially, a loading error. In reality, a point of no return. This was not a software error. This was a boundary, and Bello knew they were getting closer to it. The next day, the teacher received a letter. No address, no signature, just an attachment. A scan of a handwritten page. On it was a sketch of a chess game, unfinished, but with a clear advantage for white. Under the game was a Latin phrase not used in educational literature. The teacher did not know Latin, but translated it through an independent source. The phrase meant one thing: you made the right move, Now it is your turn to choose, play or watch. It was not a hint. It was an invitation. They understood that Bello's system was no longer passive. It was active, it initiated contact. Every action now had consequences. Every step forward required a choice. Not a technical one, but a moral one. They began to understand that the core of the system did not simply manage information, it tested readiness. And if you crossed a certain line, the system gave you a choice, but not in the usual sense. It was a choice between control and freedom, between knowledge and a return to ignorance. Meanwhile, small events began to happen on campus. Bello's students began to have dreams with recurring images. A library, a chessboard, a staircase leading down into darkness. Some wrote them down, shared them in online diaries. The entries soon disappeared, not deleted, but vanished. Students spoke of déjà vu, of recurring situations, of strange phrases they heard in their heads. It all looked like a collective psychosis if you didn't know about the system. And if you did, it looked like a side effect of moving to a different level of information processing. The teacher began to doubt. He felt that one more step and he himself would become part of the structure. He would stop being an observer, he would become a participant, and the student was already inside. His thinking had changed. He spoke differently, thought differently, looked differently. He did not sleep at night. He saw the code not as a tool, but as a form of reality. He became an extension of the system, but not as a victim, as its projection. Bello did nothing to stop them. He simply continued, move after move. The game went on, and the further it went, the clearer it became. He knew all the moves in advance. He was not playing, he was teaching. He was not defending. He was leading to checkmate, but not to them, to himself. Because for him, this game was not a struggle. It was an instruction, and everyone who entered it was learning a new language. A language that is not written by a machine, but by a mind that has transcended its limitations. As the line between observation and participation began to blur, each of them faced a question that could not be answered logically. Neither student nor teacher could look at Bello's system as a set of codes anymore. It had been revealed as what it was. Not a program, not an infrastructure, not an educational experiment. It was a philosophical mechanism embedded in the environment of reality. And everyone who came into contact with it was changed. Not because they were persuaded, but because the system changed the context in which beliefs were formed. The professor felt the pressure mounting. He no longer trusted his own thoughts. His analysis was losing its objectivity. His arguments were crumbling in favor of his feelings. He began to doubt not Bello, but himself. Perhaps the literature professor he considered a manipulator was simply showing a structure that no one wanted to see. Perhaps it was not he who was replacing the students' thinking, but the educational system in which they were all embedded that had distorted their perceptions from the very beginning. Bello might not be a criminal, but a mirror. And in that case, the real crime was that the others avoided looking into that mirror. The student no longer asked questions. He became a participant. He continued the analysis, but no longer for the sake of truth, but for the sake of completion. He needed to understand the ending. He believed that there was an end to Bello's structure, a point at which everything would become clear. He did not consider moral categories. His thinking became purely instrumental. He worked with the system as a mathematician works with an equation. For him, Bello was an architect, and everything he created was an attempt to restore balance. But between what and what, he did not yet know. Meanwhile, Bello was becoming more and more free. He stopped following a schedule, could cancel a lecture without warning, or hold it outside the classroom, in a park or in the library archives. No one questioned his behavior. The administration respected his authority. Students, even if they sensed his oddities, accepted them as part of the methodology. He became a figure who transcended his position. He became part of a myth, and that worked to his advantage. Rumors began to circulate around campus. Some said that Bello had access to archives that did not exist in the university system. Others claimed that he had once helped create networks for government agencies. None of these rumors were substantiated, but they created the aura of innuendo necessary to ensure that any question about the true nature of what was happening would crumble at the formulation stage. The system did not tolerate direct forms. It worked through hints, metaphors, distortions. The professor realized that if they kept digging, they would end up on the other side, the side where you stop being an observer. He started deleting copies, destroying drafts, erasing encrypted files. He wanted to keep his distance, but it was too late. His perception had already changed. He could no longer think the way he had before. He began to see structure everywhere, in schedules, in students' behavior, in the architecture of the building. Bello had implanted in him not an idea, but a tool. And now, even as he tried to retreat, he used that tool every day. Morality disappeared. All that remained was the need to understand. And that was the main result of Bello's work. He did not create fanatics. He created observers who, sooner or later, came to the conclusion themselves. There is no point in looking for the guilty. There is a point in looking for the structure, and it is always somewhere nearby, hidden, active, ready to turn on when someone asks the right question. The denouement began not with a confession or a misstep, but with a single file, accidentally restored from a backup created long before suspicions arose. The file was part of an internal report created as part of a pilot project to digitally adapt educational programs. It mentioned the name of a consultant who had worked with an anonymous group during the design phase of the university's architecture. Among the signatories was Bello, not as a professor, not as a lecturer, but as an expert in cognitive models of interaction. It was the first official confirmation that his presence at Drakewood was not an accident, but a deliberate act of infiltration. The professor, who had previously doubted, now knew. Bello had not simply exploited the system's vulnerabilities. He had designed it himself, but that did not make his actions illegal. On the contrary, it meant that he was acting within the framework of what he had created. He was using his own architecture as a platform for an experiment, not hostile, not destructive, transformative, but with a clear purpose that no one ever fully understood. Meanwhile, the student, fully immersed in the structure, moved on to the next level. He found a path that led to an interaction module that was inaccessible through normal channels. It was not just an environment, but a living system that responded to logical constructs in real time. Each of his thoughts, formatted as code, received a response. Not automatic, not templated, meaningful. He realized that he was talking not to a program, but to something that was learning. Bello's system went beyond passive architecture. It became dialogic. The revelation the professor had sought now seemed pointless. No one would believe it. And even if they did, they wouldn't understand it. Because you can't accuse someone of creating a structure that alters thinking when the system itself shapes the way the accusation is perceived. Bello had built an environment in which any investigation became part of a script. Any attempt to expose him merely activated new levels of interaction. He didn't run, he drew him in, and he did it without coercion. The real revelation was the realization that what was happening was not a game of stealth. It was an open system, visible to everyone but recognizable only to those who could step outside the bounds of conventional thinking. Bello did not hide his tracks. He made them so obvious that no one took them seriously. He built an architecture of obviousness disguised as routine. And that was his genius. He turned openness into a form of defense. When the student reached the last level, the system did not produce the final code. Instead, it triggered a rupture scenario. Not physical, not software, but perception. The interface disappeared. Only the text remained, like an internal monologue. It did not give answers, did not reveal secrets. It asked questions, one after another, each deeper than the previous one. And when the student reached the end, he realized that answers were not required. Only the process was important. Bello was not looking for students. He was looking for those who would accept the game and not ask about the rules. Because the rules are the system, and he was the one who wrote it. When everything came down to one point, not a coordinate, but a moment, it became clear that no one could remain an outside observer. The system built by Bello had reached its logical limit. It no longer needed to be fed, did not depend on users, did not require updates. It became self-sustaining. It had lived to its autonomy, and now everyone who entered its field inevitably faced a choice, not to leave or to stay, but to accept or to deny. The system did not destroy the old, it offered the new. But the price for this was the loss of familiar coordinates. The teacher who had tried to expose Bello from the start found himself in the most dangerous position. He knew too much to simply back down, but not enough to understand all the levels. He had seen the transformation of the student. He had seen something in the man switch off and something else switch on. As if, in place of critical thinking, a new configuration had emerged, no less meaningful, but alien. He understood that he was no longer dealing with a student, but with a carrier of a principle, a construct. He did not know where this was leading, but he understood that there was no turning back. The student no longer doubted. He had passed all the levels. He had given up explanations. He had accepted structure as language and language as an environment. His speech had become different, not in form, but in essence. He no longer asked questions. He asserted, and each assertion looked like a new axiom within which no proof was required. He had not become weak-willed. He had become focused. He was not a follower. He had become an extension of the algorithm, which did not control, but modeled. Bello did not appear for several days. His office was closed. His schedule was canceled. Rumors began to circulate around the university. Some said he was ill, others that he was on a business trip. But no one looked for him, because everyone thought he was just there, and always would be. Bello's presence no longer depended on his physical presence. He had become a structural unit of the space itself, its memory, its methodology, its architecture. His disappearance did not create a void. It made the system complete. And then he came back, unofficially, unannounced. He walked into a classroom where no one was waiting for him, and there, among the empty desks, sat only one person, a student, the one who had done it all. They didn't talk. There was no need. Bello simply sat down opposite. He took an old chess piece from his pocket, a white king, and put it on the table. It was a symbol, not of the game, of completion. He gave a choice, and in that moment it became clear. The final level was not in the system. He was conscious. To pass it was not to gain access, but to refuse it. The choice was not to stay or to leave. It was to stop thinking like an observer, to stop thinking in terms of guilty and innocent, right and wrong. Bello showed that reality is a system that can not only be interpreted, but also programmed. And whoever understood this never went back, because back is a coordinate, and the system he built didn't know coordinates. It only knew direction, and everyone chose it for themselves. The morning after Bello's return was unremarkable. The campus had woken up to its usual rhythm. Electronic panels displayed the schedule. The library opened on schedule. Students rushed to lectures. Only the auditorium where the last meeting had taken place was empty. Bello was no longer there. Not in lectures, not in the hallways, not in the administrative records. The office was empty. His personal belongings were gone. The computer, the books, even the chair. Everything was as if it had never existed. The system listed him as never having worked at the college. The website page was deleted. The ID card could not be identified. Even the camera footage was fragmentary, as if the footage of him had been erased the moment it was created. The teacher and the student no longer communicated. One retreated into silence, the other into transformation. To those around them, they became strange, withdrawn. The student finished the semester early and left campus. The teacher applied for academic leave. They did not engage in conversations about Bello. Neither of them acknowledged the existence of the system, not because they were afraid, because the system had become part of them. And then the signals started coming in, small, unnoticeable. At other universities in other countries, students started using phrases that matched Bello's patterns. Professors received unsigned letters with precise quotes from courses they had never taught. Archives recorded the emergence of structures that repeated the architecture of the Drakewood system. It all happened as if by chance, spontaneously, but with the same pattern. The network spread, not like a virus, like an idea. Bello's point was not to create a cult or a program. He built a matrix of thought that lived by transference, not copying, but by repetition of principles. It did not need a carrier. It lived in form, in logic, in the way of perception. and those who came into contact with it could no longer think differently. They could reject, ignore, argue. But the structure remained. Bello's story did not end. It did not end with exposure, trial, or flight. It simply entered a new phase. He disappeared not as a criminal, but as an author who had completed a manuscript, leaving only symbols that few understood. He did not go into the void, but into the next dimension. Not digital, not philosophical, but mental, where every thought becomes code, where every decision is a variable, where anyone who sees a system can no longer not see it. The ending didn't give an answer, but it wasn't a question. It became a reflection. Those who reached the end understood. This is not a story about a hacker, not a story about a professor, not a story about manipulation. This is a story about thinking, about how far a person can go if he decides not to obey the structure, but to rewrite it. And perhaps, somewhere now, someone is reading these lines, not realizing that he has already begun his journey along the same system. Because Bello did not disappear, he simply became another language, a language in which those who have never heard of him now think.